Tamarack Hollow isn't the kind of place that shows up on most maps. Tucked deep in the folds of western Montana, surrounded by the Lolo National Forest, the town has just enough to survive a general store, a schoolhouse that also serves as a library on weekends, and a population that could all fit into one church pew if they didn't prefer to spread out. Folks here aren't in a hurry. They plant their tomatoes. They still leave their cars unlocked. And when something goes wrong, they call each other before they call the sheriff. That's why the Tuesday morning in July felt so wrong. It wasn't just the paw prints. It was the way Ivy Turner dropped her thermos when she saw them. She had walked that path from her back porch to the mailbox every day for 20 years. But today, right there in the powdery dirt beside the stepping stones, were 3 heavy impressions, grizzly bear tracks. Each was larger than her outstretched hand, spaced apart just enough to show that whatever made them, it had walked slow and steady. Not a bear passing through. Not one. 3, walking together, toward the tree line, toward the town. She didn't scream. She backed away, picked up her thermos, and walked faster than she ever had in her life. She told her husband. He called the neighbors, and within hours, the hollow was buzzing like a hornet's nest. The sheriff's office said it was unusual. The wildlife department said it was unexpected. But for the older residents, the ones who still remembered the bear reintroduction project of '04, this wasn't unexpected at all. This was a full circle. Back then, a group of scientists and state officials had chosen Tamarack Hollow as part of a bold experiment to reintroduce grizzly bears once native to the region into safe stretches of protected land. For a while, it worked. The bears were tagged, tracked, and mostly kept to the ridgelines. Locals were promised safety. The idea was that someday grizzlies would thrive again without threatening human communities. But just 4 years and everything unraveled. Funding dried up. Ranchers complained. One incident when a tagged bear was spotted rummaging through a campsite near the school ignited a firestorm of petitions and fear. The project was defunded quietly. Some of the bears were relocated, others just vanished. People stopped talking about it. They put up new fences, repainted the warning signs, and eventually the wildness settled into myth. Until that Tuesday. This wasn't a campground sighting. These were grizzly bears in the village walking where children played and porches rocked in the afternoon sun. Not since the early 1900s had something like this happened in Tamarack Hollow. And it wasn't just the size or number of the bears, it was their calm. These weren't hungry, frantic animals. According to 2 residents who caught a glimpse from their windows, they were walking like they knew where they were going. Panic set in quickly. Families packed their bags. Children were taken to stay with relatives in Missoula. The school closed early. Sheriff Dane and 2 Fish and Wildlife officers canvassed the area, advising evacuation. They left flyers on every door, "Be bear aware." Shelter elsewhere. Most people didn't need much convincing. By nightfall, nearly 1/3 of Tamarack Hollow was empty. Curtains drawn, driveways abandoned. The postmaster didn't come to work the next day. Even the general store was boarded up, all except for one man. Walter McCain didn't pack a bag. He didn't call his son in Spokane. He didn't even bring his dog inside. He just sat on his porch like he had every other summer evening for the past decade, sipping coffee from a blue enamel mug, watching the wind move through the trees. When the sheriff stopped by to check in, Walter only nodded. "They're not here to cause trouble," he said simply. "They're just remembering something." That sentence hung in the air for days. Because for those who knew Walter and knew Caroline, his late wife, it wasn't entirely surprising. They remembered the way she used to talk to animals like they understood. The way their backyard had always been full of rescued creatures, fawns with broken legs, orphaned raccoons, and a blind crow named Pepper. And yes, once 3 tiny bear cubs barely old enough to stand. That was 20 years ago. No one had seen those cubs since. There's something powerful about collective memory. In a small place like Tamarack Hollow, stories grow slowly. They settle in people's bones. They get passed around at church picnics and firewood swaps. And when something extraordinary happens, those old stories rise again, not just as history, but as a kind of compass. Some said Walter was being reckless. Others said he was stuck in the past. But a few, like Ivy Turner, started to feel something different. "I don't know," she said to her husband after the third day of silence. "Maybe they're not strangers. Maybe they're coming home." The mystery of the bear's return was real. So was the fear. But so was the wonder. Why did 3 adult grizzlies animals, known to be solitary and territorial, travel together? Why Tamarack Hollow? Why now? And why, of all people, did Walter seem so certain? That question began to gnaw at the edges of the narrative. Not all animals behave the way we expect, and not all wild creatures forget the hands that once held them. Biologists now understand more than ever about the emotional capacity of wild animals, particularly those raised in early human contact. Grizzlies, like elephants and whales, exhibit strong spatial memory, return to key locations, and in some cases show recognition behaviors long after human interaction. It's not just science, it's connection. But there's a lesson buried in this too. As much as we try to push nature back, move it farther from our homes, fence it off from our towns, it remembers. The forest remembers. The animals remember. Sometimes what we cast out finds its way back, not to threaten us, but to remind us of something we forgot. That's what Tamarack Hollow was facing. Not just 3 wild animals on their streets, but the ghost of a promise once made to care for the land and for the lives it carried. So when Walter stayed behind, he wasn't just ignoring a warning. He was answering a call. And what happened next would change everything people thought they knew about grizzly bears, about memory and the lines between wild and home. Because that evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, 3 shadows emerged from the forest again. And this time, they didn't stop at the trees. Where we meet Walter, not just as a man refusing to leave, but as someone who never truly let go. Walter McCain never made a fuss. He was the kind of man who repaired what was broken, remembered birthdays no one else did, and kept a deck of cards on the kitchen table, even though no one had played with him in years. When the notices came warnings of grizzly bears in the area, recommendations to evacuate, he nodded, thanked the ranger, and went back to stacking firewood. The truth was, Walter had seen worse. Blizzards that wiped out fences and roads. Wildfires that turned the sky orange for a week. He'd watched friends leave one by one, chasing better jobs or better weather. Caroline's passing was the only storm he hadn't prepared for, and he survived that too. Barely. But the morning Ivy Turner found those paw prints, something in Walter stirred. Not fear, no surprise, just a quiet certainty. Like an old song you haven't heard in years, but still remember the words. He didn't call his son, didn't check the news. He brewed coffee, sat on the porch, and looked out across the pine ridge where the forest thickens into shadow. He stayed because he was waiting, and he had been for a long time. The grizzlies showing up wasn't random, not to him. 20 years earlier, on the far end of town where the road breaks into dirt, Walter and Caroline worked at Pine Ridge Ecology Station, a modest facility that had once been the heart of a bold experiment reintroducing grizzly bears into their native Montana habitat. It wasn't glamorous. Walter was in charge of maintenance, but Caroline, who had been a field vet in her younger days, was brought in part-time to help the biologists with rescue cases. That's how they found the cubs. Late spring unseasonal snow. A mother bear found dead by the tracks, probably poisoned. Her cubs were hiding in a thicket nearby. 2 males, 1 female, just weeks old. Too young to be relocated. Too wild for captivity. Walter remembered how small they were. One could fit in the crook of his arm. They were frightened, but not feral. Caroline didn't hesitate. "They'll die without warmth," she said, wrapping them in an old quilt. They need to feel safe before they learn to survive. So for the next 7 months, their small cabin on the station grounds became something between a home and a den. Caroline named them Boone River and Cedar. They fed them goat's milk every 3 hours, warmed towels in the oven for bedding, and taught them to eat berries from a wooden bowl. When they grew strong enough to stumble outside, Walter built them a sandbox near the edge of the yard. Not for play, Caroline insisted, but to teach them how to dig. People say you shouldn't raise wild animals like pets. And Walter agreed. But that wasn't what this was. It wasn't ownership. It was stewardship. A temporary promise held until the wild could take over again. By the time winter came, the bears were almost ready. Strong, alert, wary of strangers. Caroline weaned them off human touch. They moved the feeding spot farther into the woods each day. And then one snowy morning, the cubs didn't return to the porch. They had found their path. Caroline watched the tree line for hours that day, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, mug going cold in her hands. She didn't cry. She just said, "They'll remember where love came from, always." But the project didn't last. Within the next year, state funding will be pulled. The ecology station was shut down. Most of the animals were relocated to larger preserves. Walter and Caroline, retired quietly, stayed in town and kept to themselves. No one ever saw Boone River or Cedar again. Until now. That's why when the town scattered, Walter stayed. Not because he was stubborn, but because he believed. He believed in the imprint of love. He believed that bonds formed early in the right hands leave a kind of fingerprint that time can't smudge. He kept busy. Swept the porch, left apples at the edge of the yard, moved the rocking chair to face the woods. That's where he was, hands folded, eyes soft, when the grizzly bears returned. It wasn't dramatic. No charging, no roaring, just three forms moving through the trees like shadows pulled by memory. The same pace, the same calm presence Ivy had described. Only this time, they weren't passing through. They came straight to Walter's yard. Boone, the largest, stepped forward. He was enormous now, easily 700 pounds, with a patch of gray fur across his left shoulder. But his eyes, Walter said later, still had that flicker of mischief. River followed close behind her head, slightly lowered, like she was sniffing for something familiar. Cedar, ever the smallest, walked in, last pausing now and then to glance sideways as if making sure the others were truly going home. They stopped 10 feet from the porch. No growls, no movements, just presence. Walter didn't speak right away. He watched them, coffee in hand, breath steady. And then in the same tone he'd once used to greet them at breakfast, he said, "It's been a while, boys." Boone huffed a deep exhale that seemed more acknowledgement than warning. Then, in a gesture that would leave even the most seasoned wildlife expert baffled, he lowered himself to the ground. Not alert, not defensive, just resting. Like he had done 20 years ago, on a towel warmed by a kitchen oven. The other two followed. Walter smiled and sipped his coffee. The lesson here isn't just about memory. It's about the quiet power of consistency. Walter didn't try to tame them. He didn't force them to come closer. He simply offered stillness, a place that once meant safety. And the bears, against everything biology might predict, returned to it. It's easy to dismiss this as sentimental. But even science now admits what Walter understood intuitively. Grizzly bears, like many large mammals, are capable of spatial recognition, individual memory, and in some cases, long-term emotional bonding. A study from the University of Alberta found that mother grizzlies teach their cubs complex roots and behaviors that are remembered into adulthood. Memory in wild animals isn't just survival. Sometimes it's a relationship. Of course, Tamarack Hollow didn't know any of this yet. All they knew was that Walter had stayed and hadn't been harmed. That started to shift the town's story. People who had panicked now grew curious. Some stood farther back in the woods with binoculars. Others called the wildlife office, not to complain, but to ask questions. And Ivy Turner, the woman who had first seen the paw prints, became the first to say it out loud. If they remember him, maybe we were wrong to fear them. That's not to say the bears weren't dangerous. Grizzlies are still wild animals, massive, unpredictable, and naturally territorial. But this wasn't a story of control. It was one of trust. Walter didn't demand anything from them. He didn't step off the porch. He didn't need to. What passed between him and the bears wasn't about performance or reward. It was about return, and every Thursday after that first visit they did. Same time, same path, same silent presence. The town began to settle. Questions shifted from, "Are we safe?" to "Why here and why now?" People started gathering near Walter's property, keeping distance but drawn to the quiet magic of it all. Local children asked to visit Grandpa Bear. A team of researchers from Missoula requested permission to study the behavior. But Walter kept things simple. He greeted them, watched them, sometimes left food, but mostly he just sat and waited, like he always had. Because for Walter McCain, this wasn't a spectacle. It was family. And the return of Boone River and Cedar wasn't the start of something, it was the continuation of a promise. And the next part of the story would prove just how much these bears remembered. Where we return to a winter long forgotten, and the day Caroline made a decision that would change the course of 3 wild lives forever. It was early spring when they first heard the cries. The snow had started melting, but patches of white still clung to the ridges above Pine Ridge Ecology Station. Walter had just come in from splitting kindling when Caroline paused at the kitchen sink spoon mid-air and tilted her head toward the window. "Do you hear that?" she said. It was faint, a whimper almost like a wounded dog. Then another, high-pitched, rhythmic, from the tree line just past the shed. Walter grabbed his coat. Caroline pulled on her boots. They didn't find anything at first, just damp earth, scattered pine cones, and a few broken branches. But then Caroline spotted a small print in the mud. Not a raccoon, not a fox. "Bear cub," she whispered. A few more steps and they saw them, 3 little shapes, huddled under a downed log, their fur matted with mud ribs faintly visible beneath their bellies. The cubs didn't run. They didn't growl. They barely moved, just watched. Caroline knelt beside them. "Mama's not coming back," she murmured. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just an absence. Probably poisoned bait, she thought. A terrible but not uncommon fate for bears that wandered too close to ranches. "We can't leave them here," she said. Walter didn't argue. At the time, the Pine Ridge Ecology Station was part of a government-backed initiative to reintroduce grizzly bears to this part of Montana. The land had once been full of them before hunting development and fear drove them out. The project's goal was simple: raise orphaned cubs until they were strong enough to survive, then release them into the protected forest. Walter's job was facility maintenance, feeding, fencing, fixing pipes. Caroline had signed on later as a part-time wildlife technician. She had experience with big animals, wolves, bobcats, and even one injured mountain lion. But bears were different, bigger, stronger, less predictable. Still, something about these 3 cubs softened her. She wrapped them in towels from their camper, bundled them into a wooden crate lined with straw, and brought them into the small caretaker cabin just behind the main station building. "Just for the night," she told the lead biologist. "They're too weak to be moved." The station didn't argue. They were understaffed and out of funding. It was a quiet emergency. No paperwork. No one else needed to know. Caroline named them that evening. Boone, the biggest, had a slight crook in his front paw. Cedar, the runt, had a white patch on his chest shaped like a leaf. River, the only female, had soft, intelligent eyes and a habit of nosing the air when she heard Caroline's voice. The next few weeks became a blur of feeding schedules, improvised heat lamps, and sleepless nights. Caroline fed them goat's milk with a bottle every 3 hours. Walter built a pen from salvaged fencing behind the shed. They used a baby monitor to listen to their breathing. And when Caroline hummed lullabies quietly while rocking in her chair, Boone would inch closer to her boots. "They're not pets," Walter reminded her. "I know," she said, "but they don't. There's something about early bonding that leaves a mark. Not just in humans, in wolves, in elephants, in wild animals, who learn trust before they learn fear." Caroline didn't coddle them. She didn't try to tame them, but she showed them what safety could look like. Every day they moved the food bowls a few feet farther from the porch. Every night they opened the pen gates just a little earlier. The cubs grew fast. By autumn, Boone weighed nearly 120 pounds. Cedar was still scrappy, but fast. River was sharp. She started caching food in corners of the yard, a survival instinct taking hold. Caroline knew the time was coming. She stopped calling them by name in front of the others. She spent more time alone with them at dusk, sitting on the porch with her shawl pulled tight, whispering things Walter couldn't quite hear. Then one morning in late October, with frost hugging the grass and smoke rising slow from the chimney, the cubs didn't come back. "They're gone," Caroline said quietly. Walter nodded. He'd seen it coming. She stood by the tree line for hours, not crying, just watching. That winter was the hardest. The cabin felt colder even with the stove running. The yard looked empty, but Caroline never doubted. "They'll remember us," she said one night, stirring soup. "We weren't just feeders. We were family." The ecology station closed the following spring. Official reason: lack of measurable success. Too costly, too many unknowns. The facility was shut down. The animals, those that could be tracked, were moved to larger preserves. Others disappeared into the forest, their fates unknown. Walter and Caroline stayed in Tamarack Hollow. Their work, as far as the world was concerned, was over, but something had changed in both of them. They began walking the ridge trail every Sunday, not to monitor, but to watch. Caroline would carry a bag of dried fruit in her coat pocket, just in case. She wrote notes in a small blue journal, sightings, wind direction, scat patterns, none of which she shared with anyone. Caroline passed away 6 years later after a quiet battle with cancer. She asked to be buried beneath a stand of white pines behind the old station. Walter was honored by that. He carved her name into a wooden marker, placed the shawl she used to wear over the grave, and said goodbye. But he didn't stop walking the trail, every Sunday, for years. Because a promise once made doesn't expire just because time passes. And the truth is, wild animals don't forget as easily as we think. There are countless examples: elephants returning to the grave sites of their dead. Wolves howl when separated from bonded humans. Dolphins responding to familiar sounds decades after last contact. And now, perhaps, grizzly bears. The story of Boone River and Cedar wasn't written in textbooks. It wasn't captured by researchers or posted online. But it lived in Walter, in the way he spoke about them, in the silence he held space for. What's easy to overlook is how small decisions, one crate, one bottle, one sleepless night, can ripple outward across decades. That's what this part of the story shows us. That love, when given without condition, imprints deeper than science always understands. Caroline didn't save those cubs for attention. She did it because that's what her hands were made to do. And somewhere deep in the pine-covered heart of Montana, those bears didn't forget. When they came back to Tamarack Hollow, it wasn't a coincidence. It was an echo. And Walter, all those years later, answered without hesitation. What happened next would blur the line between wild instinct and something far more human. Where the past meets the present on a quiet Thursday afternoon, and a look between old friends says more than any words ever could. Walter didn't flinch when he saw them again. It was a Thursday, late afternoon. The kind of golden quiet that makes everything seem slower, softer. He was on the porch, same spot as always, a mug of coffee in hand, and his old dog Scout sleeping beside him. The sun was easing its way behind the ridge, and the forest at the edge of the property shimmered in that strange light only Montana evenings know. That's when the shadows moved. 3 figures, large, deliberate, not rushing. Just walking the way someone walks when they already know where they're going. Not hunters, not drifters, they were following a path that only they remembered. Scout barked once, then went silent. Walter leaned forward in his chair, set the mug down on the armrest, and stood. Boone emerged first. Bigger than Walter remembered, massive, really, his back high as a pickup hood. A broad scar ran across his left shoulder, fur discolored, the only real giveaway that life in the wild hadn't been easy. Behind him, River moved gracefully with that same quiet alertness she had as a cub. Cedar brought up the rear, head low, sniffing now and then as if pulling old scent from the air. They stopped 20 feet from the porch. There was no growl, no sound, just a kind of stillness that filled the air. Scout didn't move. Walter didn't either. He only took a step forward, his hands at his sides, his shoulders loose, as if greeting neighbors rather than apex predators. He looked straight at Boone and smiled. "Well," he said softly, "you made it. It's easy to forget how powerful silence can be. But in that moment, it said everything. Because Boone didn't posture or charge, he didn't circle or sniff, he simply lowered his massive body to the ground like an animal who knows it has come home. River followed, lying near a patch of wildflowers Caroline had planted years before. Cedar stood a moment longer, then slowly folded his legs beneath him. 3 full-grown grizzly bears stretched out in the yard, like they'd never left. Walter didn't speak again for a long time. He didn't need to. He sat back down, reached for his coffee, and just watched them. His eyes didn't water, but his chest moved differently. Scout leaned against his boot. The moment had the feel of a reunion that no one believed would ever happen, but had been quietly hoped for every day for 20 years. To the outside world, this scene would seem impossible. Bears don't remember people. Bears don't sit peacefully in the yards of humans. Bears don't come back. But the truth is, we've underestimated wild animals for a long time. Studies from the last decade show growing evidence that grizzly bears, like elephants, can remember locations, relationships, and even emotional cues long after the event. In Yellowstone, researchers tracked a female bear who returned to the same den site 17 years in a row, likely because of a strong early association. In Alberta, a rehabilitated cub later recognized a human caretaker by scent after 12 years in the wild. Recognition is more than memory. It's an attachment, and that's what was unfolding here. Walter didn't need science to tell him that. He could see it in the way Boone watched him, not with suspicion, but with familiarity. There was no fear, there was no confusion, just presence. Later, when the researchers from Missoula came to observe, Dr. Ellen Pierce described it as profound interspecies, imprinting a term typically used for birds. Rarely for mammals as large and autonomous as bears. They're not responding to food, she said. They're responding to the relationship. It wasn't about taming. These weren't pets. They were still wild, still powerful. But something had rooted deep during those months in the cabin, the bottle feedings, the lullabies, the scent of pine smoke and soup and Caroline's shawl, and it hadn't faded with time. That first afternoon, they stayed for nearly an hour. Walter didn't approach. He knew better. He offered space, not control. And when the bears eventually stood one by one and turned back toward the trees, he didn't call after them. He just nodded once, quietly, like saying goodbye to someone you're sure you'll see again. And he would. The following Thursday, just before dusk, they returned. Same path, same distance, same ritual. This time, Boone carried something in his jaws, a branch stripped of leaves with tufts of fur caught in the bark. He set it gently near the porch, then backed away. A gift. Dr. Pierce would later explain that such behavior had been observed in wolves offering items to packmates or bonded humans. Among wild animals, especially predators, it's rare. But it happens, and when it does, it's not arbitrary. The bears were making a statement. We remember you. You still matter to us. The townspeople began to take notice. At first, from a distance. Ivy Turner was the first to return, walking the trail behind the McCain property with her husband, binoculars dangling from her neck, heart beating faster than she admitted. She didn't see them that day, but she heard them, a low, distant chuff, and Walter's voice carried faintly through the trees. You're still Boone to me. Later that week, Ivy told the others. I think he knew they'd come back. I think Caroline did too. It shifted something in the town. People stopped thinking of the bears as intruders. They started thinking of them as something else, something shared, something meaningful. A few teens painted signs, "Respect the Ridge." The school counselor asked her students to write poems about what it means to be remembered. One boy wrote, "He stayed when everyone else left." And they came back not because they were wild, but because they knew where home was. Walter never claimed to understand it. He didn't explain much. When reporters called, he turned them away. When people asked why the bears kept coming, he just said, "We knew each other once." That counts for something. And maybe that's the lesson. In a world moving faster by the day, full of noise and urgency and sharp edges, maybe the wild, true wildlife isn't something separate from us. Maybe it's just waiting for us to remember our part in it. Because that Thursday visit wasn't an accident. It was a choice by 3 animals once held in human hands, once left behind, once forgotten by a project, but not by the people who fed them, warmed them, whispered to them. And when they returned, it wasn't for food. It was for recognition, not dominance, not dependence, just quiet understanding. There's something sacred in that. And the next week, they brought more than a branch, where the bears begin to bring offerings, proof not of hunger, but of family, of instinct shaped by memory and wild hearts shaped by kindness. They came every Thursday, not Tuesday, not Friday, always Thursday. Walter never marked it on a calendar. He didn't set a reminder or clear a schedule. He just knew. Around 5 in the evening, give or take, he'd brew a fresh pot of coffee, put on his faded flannel, and sit on the porch facing the woods. Scout, as usual, at his feet. And, like clockwork, the bears would appear. Boone always led. River followed, measured and calm. Cedar, ever cautious, lingered behind, checking the path with that careful nose of his. The bears moved with purpose, not as though they were roaming, but returning. And every week they brought something new. It started with the branch, a strange offering stripped clean, placed carefully at the edge of the porch. The following week, Boone dropped a large antler. The week after, River carried what looked like the cleaned rib bone of a deer, its edges dry and smooth. Cedar once dragged up a bundle of feathers, damp and neatly arranged. At first, Walter didn't understand. He thought perhaps it was a coincidence. Bears often relocate remnants of their kills. But these were different. There were no signs of fresh blood, no signs of consumption, and each item was set gently in the same place at the base of the porch steps, just where Caroline used to leave their feeding bowls 2 decades earlier. Then came the week Boone brought the trout. It was whole, clean, laid belly up in the grass. Walter didn't touch it, but he smiled. "You're feeding me now," he whispered. "I see." Animals offer food for many reasons. In social species, wolves, elephants, chimpanzees, gift-giving isn't just instinct. It's communication, an expression of alliance, of status, of care. In grizzlies, it's rare. They're not pack animals, not known for sharing. But when early life bonding occurs, especially during periods of vulnerability, those rules can bend. Dr. Ellen Pierce, watching from a blind spot 200 yards out, recorded everything. She kept quiet most of the time, not wanting to interfere. But she documented each item, every placement, every visit. "This isn't random," she told her team. "It's familial. It's a ritual." On the 6th visit, Boone didn't bring anything. Instead, he paused at the porch, looked up at Walter, and let out a sound that wasn't a growl or a grunt. It was something between a huff and a sigh. Low, long, intentional. Walter replied, not with words, but with a nod, as if they'd agreed on something unspoken. That week, the local school got involved. Mrs. Delaney, the 5th grade teacher, had her class write letters to the bears who remember. They filled them with drawings, crayon sketches of brown fur, tall trees, a man on a rocking chair. Some kids added poems, others wrote questions. "Do you like fish? Do you remember being little? Can we come say hi?" Walter read a few of them aloud on the porch the next Thursday. River tilted her head at the sound of his voice. Cedar pawed at the dirt where Caroline's flowers once bloomed. The town started to shift. It wasn't that people stopped being cautious. These were, after all, grizzly bears. But the fear became curiosity. The curiosity became care. Ivy Turner started a Facebook group, Tamarack Hollow Wildlife Watch. Tourists came, but only from a distance. No one dared step beyond the barbed wire Walter kept as a quiet boundary. The wildlife department sent in a drone. The footage was extraordinary. It showed 3 bears approaching, placing items, then lying in the grass for long stretches, resting, sometimes even closing their eyes while Walter sat nearby. There was no aggression, no stress indicators, no fear, just a kind of peace that's rarely seen between man and beast. Dr. Pierce, in one interview, said, "This behavior aligns more closely with what we see in elephants returning to the bones of their dead acts of reverence. Recognition, possibly even mourning. And that idea that wild animals might mourn or remember or give thanks sparked something deeper." Walter began bringing small items out with him. Not food, never food, just pieces of memory. One week he placed a carved wooden toy on the porch, the same kind he'd made for the cubs 20 years earlier. A block of cedar shaped into a small bear. Boone approached it slowly, sniffed it, then sat beside it without touching it. Another time, Walter unfolded Caroline's old shawl, laying it across the bench, where she used to hum lullabies on cool evenings. River walked in a slow circle around it, then lay down 2 feet away, head resting on her paws, facing the fabric. Each interaction felt like a page turned in a book no one had realized was still being written. One day, Cedar brought something that changed everything. It wasn't food or a bone or a branch. It was a flat, palm-sized rock, smooth, round, clearly chosen. It had no immediate meaning, but Walter picked it up and turned it in his hand. There, scratched faintly into one side, whether by claw or accident, was a mark. A jagged line intersected by 2 others, a kind of symbol, not language, of course, but intention, maybe. Walter placed it next to Caroline's photo on the windowsill. "These are not just gifts," he told Dr. Pierce. "They're reminders." Each week became a meditation. He never knew what they'd bring or how long they'd stay. Sometimes it was only 10 minutes. Sometimes over an hour, but always with purpose, always with care. Walter never crossed the yard, never tried to touch them. That boundary, the space between porch and pine, was sacred. It was trust unspoken. And maybe that's what made the visits matter even more, because true connection doesn't require closeness. It requires presence, a willingness to show up again and again, without needing to be anything more than what you are. For Walter, it became a second kind of family. For the town, it became a living story. And for the bears, it was something older than science, deeper than instinct. It was a return to where they first learned safety. A ritual, a rhythm, a quiet exchange between those who had once shared bottle and breath. And one week, everything changed again. The bears didn't come alone. Where the memory of love becomes legacy and a photograph unlocks something even the scientists couldn't explain. It was mid-September when the change began. The bears arrived as they had every Thursday, but something was different. Boone moved more slowly, not injured, just deliberate. He paused longer at the edge of the yard, looking at Walter, then at the porch, then up toward the ridge where the sun had just started to dip behind the trees. Walter noticed it immediately. He didn't say anything. He simply reached for a small wooden box beneath his chair. Inside was a photograph, weathered color, fading slightly at the edges. Caroline standing on the cabin steps holding 3 bear cubs in her arms. Boone was one of them, his head tilted toward the camera, eyes half closed in comfort. Walter walked to the edge of the porch and placed the photo on the ground, angled gently toward the bears. He sat back down, hands folded. Boone stepped forward inch by inch, the way animals do when something pulls at their memory. River followed her breath, audible, slow, and deep. Cedar lagged. Boone reached the photo first. He didn't touch it, he didn't sniff it and move on. He stood over it, still head lowered, eyes locked on the image as if trying to align memory with reality. And then from deep within his chest came a sound that Walter hadn't heard in 2 decades. A low rumble, not threat, not growl, closer to a hum. A vibration of recognition. River let out a quiet whine. Cedar lowered his head. Walter swallowed hard. "They remember her," he said quietly. "They know she's gone." Dr. Ellen Pierce, watching from a camouflaged distance, recorded everything. Later, she would describe the moment as behavioral mourning, a term typically reserved for elephants or great apes. She'd seen footage of wolves lingering at the site of a fallen packmate. She'd read about whales carrying dead calves for miles. But this 3 wild grizzly bears returning weekly to the home of their former caretaker, recognizing a photo, responding with what looked and felt unmistakably like grief. It was unprecedented, but it didn't end there. The next week, Walter brought out Caroline's shawl, the soft blue one she always wore when bottle-feeding the cubs. He draped it over the bench beside the porch. Boone approached, stopped short, and sat facing it, not moving, just sitting. Cedar walked in a slow circle around it before lying down at its base. River leaned forward, nose twitching, then settled into the grass paws folded beneath her chest. Walter didn't cry, but something in his face softened. His fingers gripped the armrest of the rocking chair, his foot still. "You never forgot her," he whispered. "She didn't forget you either." From that point on, the visits shifted. The bears began staying longer. They no longer brought gifts. Instead, they returned to spots where they had once played. Boone sat beneath the tree where Walter had tied a tire swing for them as cubs. River lay near the flower bed where Caroline had once planted lavender. Cedar pawed at the stump where they used to climb and tumble. It wasn't routine. It was remembrance. Walter responded in kind. He brought out other pieces of Caroline's life, her gardening gloves, the tin mug she used for morning tea, a recording of her humming an old hymn. One afternoon, when he played the recording on a small speaker, all 3 bears lifted their heads at once. Boone stood turned toward the house and let out a single short sound. Not loud, not aggressive, just full. Walter looked up. That was her song, wasn't it? Dr. Pierce shared the footage with colleagues at several research institutions. Theories varied. Some said it was residual conditioning. Others claimed coincidence. But the consensus was clear: the bears associated Caroline with safety care and affection. And even after 2 decades in the wild, those memories held shape. The lesson, perhaps, is this: animals remember kindness with more clarity than we give them credit for. We often think of wild animals as distant, instinct-driven creatures responding only to hunger, fear, or territory. But evidence continues to mount among elephants, dolphins, parrots, and yes, grizzly bears, that memory is not just mechanical, it's emotional. And when animals are treated with gentleness, with patience, with presence, something deeper imprints. That imprint doesn't fade with time. It waits. Walter knew that. Caroline knew it too. She used to say love leaves a scent. They'll follow it home. By October, the visits became quieter. Boone no longer walked to the porch. He stayed near the ridge, watching. River lingered in the trees. Cedar would come to the edge, but not cross the line where the grass turned gold. It felt like a slow withdrawal, not avoidance, acceptance. They were saying goodbye. Walter prepared for it. He wrote a letter, one he kept folded in the front pocket of his jacket. It wasn't long. Just a note to the town, the researchers, and anyone who might still wonder what this all meant. He wrote, "They were never ours, but for a time they trusted us, and we tried to be worthy of that trust. Caroline gave them love. I gave them space. In return, they gave us a story bigger than fear, bigger than science, a story about return, about what happens when you don't forget." On the last Thursday in October, the bears came once more. Boone led as always. He walked to the center of the yard, stood still for a long moment, then lifted his head toward the house and let out a long, deep breath. Not a roar, just breath, like an exhale meant to carry something unseen. Then he turned. River followed. Cedar hesitated at the edge, looked back once, then disappeared into the trees. They didn't return the week after, or the week after that. But they had left something behind. The story, the presence, The proof that memory, when built on care, can carry across species, years, even generations. And soon, that story would grow. Because the bears hadn't just remembered Caroline and Walter. They were about to introduce someone new, where the cycle of memory expands through small pores, cautious steps, and a lineage that still knows where home is. It was a quiet Thursday in early spring weeks after the bears' last visit when Walter noticed the shift. The first sign wasn't sound or movement. It was the birds. Chickadees near the feeder froze mid-hop. A pair of jays flitted into the spruce and went still. Scout Walter's old dog lifted his head, not with alarm, but something closer to interest. Walter set down his mug and leaned forward in the rocking chair. The ridge ahead, still shadowed from the morning sun, was moving. Boone stepped out first. It had been nearly a month since his last appearance, and already he looked leaner, winter-worn, his coat shedding in patches. He paused near the wild lilacs and looked toward the house just as he always did. But this time he didn't come alone. Two smaller bears, nearly yearlings, maybe 8 months old, ambled out behind him. Cubs, a bit wobbly, a little unsure, staying close to their father's legs, like children behind a parent in a crowd. Walter didn't move. He simply whispered, "Well, I'll be." The two cubs sniffed the air, poked at pine cones, then tumbled sideways into one another near the edge of the yard. Boone didn't interfere. He only watched. River appeared shortly after, moving with that same quiet dignity she had always carried. She stayed at the tree line, her body still, her eyes scanning. They weren't here for food. There was none. Walter never left bait. This was something else. Boone walked toward the porch, stopped halfway, and then did something new. He turned toward the cubs and let out a soft, chuffing sound, a low burst of breath through his nostrils. The cubs looked up. He repeated it. They froze for a moment, then slowly approached the edge of the yard, where the flattened grass still held the memory of old visits. That's when it clicked. He was introducing them. Walter remained seated, hands in his lap, heart steady. The bears weren't just returning, they were expanding the circle. Later, Dr. Ellen Pierce would describe the scene as cross-generational imprinting. In grizzly bear behavior, the transfer of location familiarity isn't common. But here, Boone was modeling a return not for food or safety, but to a place of significance. A place where years before he and his siblings had learned what comfort, calm, and love could look like, even from a different species. The cubs sniffed near the wooden toy Walter had left out weeks earlier. One swatted it gently, then dropped onto its side in the grass. The other pawed at the earth, unearthed an old buried bone Boone had once brought and carried it in its mouth like a prize. Walter smiled. "They're home," he said softly. "And they're safe." The scene didn't last long, maybe 15 minutes. River gave a short call and the cubs bounded back toward her, one tripping over a root as it ran. Boone lingered for a few seconds more. He looked back once, not at the porch, but at the yard itself, then turned and followed. The bears vanished into the trees. But the meaning didn't. Word spread through Tamarack Hollow quickly. The story wasn't just about the bears now. It was about their cubs. People began calling them Caroline's grandchildren, even if they weren't directly tied to her hand, only to the love she once gave. For Walter, the moment changed everything. Because it wasn't just memory now. It was continuity. It proved that what had been built between humans and wild animals, between one woman's compassion and 3 abandoned cubs, hadn't stopped when Caroline passed. It hadn't ended with the last bottle or lullaby. It had carried forward. Boone, once cradled in a towel by a woman humming a hymn, was now showing his own cubs where trust had once lived. Walter started preparing again. He didn't build anything new. He didn't fence the yard or mark the trail. He simply carved 2 small figures from soft cedar wood miniature bears and placed them gently next to the original carvings of Boone River and Cedar. Then he added a stone flat round cool. On it, he etched a simple line with a wood-burning pen. "Come and go in peace." A few days later, a local school teacher brought a group of 4th graders to visit from a safe distance. They stayed behind a wildlife blind, 300 feet out, watching through field scopes. That day, the cubs returned. They played in the same patch of dirt where Caroline used to lay out towels in the spring sun. One of the girls, a quiet student named Maddie, said something no one forgot. Maybe love's not just for people. Maybe animals carry it too, just in different ways. Mrs. Delaney wrote that on the chalkboard the next day. More visits followed, always on Thursdays. The cubs grew bolder, more curious, but never reckless. Boone kept a close eye. River remained nearby, ready, but the tone was always the same, calm, purposeful, and each visit carried a new layer of behavior. Sometimes the cubs would bring things leaves, feathers, even once a bright blue bottle cap likely found in the stream. They weren't hunting, they weren't searching, they were learning how to share. Dr. Pierce observed, "This is teachable behavior." Boone is modeling reciprocal interaction. He's not just passing on foraging or migration routes. He's passing on social interpretation, and it involves a human. That part no one could fully explain. How does a bear distinguish the one human worth returning to from the thousands it might fear? What language, if not words, do animals use to communicate the memory of love? Maybe we're only beginning to understand. Walter didn't try to label it. He only said Caroline would be proud. He started setting out symbolic gifts again. Never food. Once a small bundle of wild mint was tied with twine. Another time, a hand-drawn picture of Caroline, sketched by a local teenager, was laminated and set beneath a stone. Boone once approached that picture, sniffed it, and let out a quiet sound. One of the cubs mirrored him. To outsiders, it might seem like projection. To those who had watched it unfold over months, over years, it felt like something more. It felt like legacy. A shared memory passed through fur and breath and bone. A story retold not through language but through return. A memory you can walk through one paw print at a time. Tamarack Hollow changed again. People visited from other states. Scientists requested interviews, but most locals didn't want to talk. They just wanted to listen, to watch, to keep the peace that had settled around Walter's porch. They knew deep down that it wouldn't last forever. And they were right. Because by the following spring, the bears began staying farther away. Boone came less often. The cubs, nearly grown, began to explore without him. The pattern was shifting again. And Walter, he was growing tired. He never said it outright. But Scout stopped going on long walks. Walter spent more time in the chair, less in the yard. He smiled less, but with more meaning when he did. And the bears, maybe sensing it, did something they had never done before. They came to the house, where the end becomes a beginning and the deepest memory is the one that chooses to stay behind. It was a Thursday, not just any Thursday. Walter hadn't left the porch that morning. His coffee sat cold on the windowsill. Scout curled on the rug by his bed. The wooden bears, carved with careful hands, lined the sill beside Caroline's photo, polished smooth from years of sun. The doctor had visited on Tuesday. Quiet voice, kind eyes. The word cancer came and went like a passing truck on a distant road. Walter didn't say much after, just asked to stay home. He wasn't leaving the place where his memories lived, not the porch where he first saw Boone return, not the woods where River used to rest, not the soil where Caroline was buried beneath the pines. By late afternoon, the forest fell still. Then footsteps, heavy, steady, not hurried. Scout raised his head but didn't bark. Walter, though too weak to stand, turned his face toward the window. 3 shadows moved across the yard. Boone stepped forward first, like always. Not boldly, not hesitantly, just present. River and Cedar followed behind. They crossed the space they had always stopped short of. The invisible line that had for years marked the boundary between man and memory. This time they crossed it. They came up to the house. Boone stood just beneath the window, close enough for Walter to hear the huff of his breath through the glass. Walter smiled. "I'm here, my boy," he said, voice almost a whisper. "Daddy's here." Boone raised his head, made a low rolling sound. One part exhale, one part farewell. River sat down. Cedar stayed back pacing once in a slow arc, watching. The three bears stood beneath the window for nearly 10 minutes. They didn't move much. They didn't look away. Dr. Ellen Pierce watched from the tree line, notepad in hand, binoculars pressed to her face, tears running unchecked. "This is not instinct," she said aloud. "This is goodbye." When the bears finally turned to leave, Boone lingered last. He gave one final look at the window, then disappeared into the trees, silent as snow. Walter passed away 3 days later. Scout lay beside him. The window was still cracked open, letting in the spring breeze. At the funeral, the town gathered. Everyone, old, young, the curious, and the quiet. Even those who had once feared the grizzly bears came with stories now. Stories of watching from behind trees, of quiet visits, of something sacred they couldn't quite explain. As the pastor read the final prayer, someone gasped. 3 shapes appeared on the ridge above the cemetery. Boone, River, Cedar. They didn't move. They stood like sentinels, massive, unblinking, unafraid, watching from the rise above Tamarack Hollow, overlooking the grave where Walter now rested beside Caroline. For 20 minutes, they remained unmoving. Then, as quietly as they'd come, they turned single file and slipped into the forest. No one forgot that moment. Later, Dr. Pierce wrote a formal paper titled Grizzly Bears and Long-Term Cross-Species Attachment, the McCain Case. It detailed not just behavioral observations, but reflections on memory, social bonds, and emotional recognition. Walter McCain, she wrote, didn't just raise 3 cubs. He challenged our understanding of what's possible between wild animals and humans when kindness leads the way. The McCain property was turned into a conservation learning site. The house was left untouched. The porch still held the rocking chair. The carvings remained on the windowsill. Caroline's garden was gently replanted by local volunteers. Her shore was framed in glass and placed in the visitor cabin. Children from across the state sent letters. One boy mailed in a drawing of Boone beside Walter, both looking up at the stars. At the base he'd written, "You don't have to speak the same language to say I love you." Even now, years later, Boone still visits the ridge, sometimes with River, sometimes alone. He doesn't come to the porch anymore. He doesn't bring gifts, but those who watch from the wildlife cameras say he always looks toward the house, toward the place where once someone had offered him safety and love. We often talk about wild animals as distant as unknowable. But what Walter and Caroline taught us is something far simpler and far deeper, that connection is not limited by species. That trust, when built on consistency and care, becomes legacy. There's a reason the cubs returned, a reason Boone brought his children, a reason the bears climbed the hill, because love, when given freely, lasts. It doesn't need words, it doesn't follow rules, and it doesn't forget. So maybe this story wasn't just about grizzly bears or wildlife or some rare behavior captured in a forest clearing. Maybe it's about us, about how we show up, how we treat the vulnerable, how we remember those who once held us, whether they had hands or paws or fur still damp from snow. And maybe, just maybe, it's about legacy. Because every act of kindness, no matter how quiet, leaves a trace, a paw print in the soil, a carved figure on a porch, a whisper in the trees. Now, I'd like to invite you to pause. Ask yourself, who has given you love that still lives inside you? And who might need that kind of love from you today? If this story moved you, if it reminded you of something true or beautiful or forgotten, please consider sharing it. Leave a comment, share your memory, and if you'd like to walk with us through more stories like this of wildlife wonder and the deep connections that make us human, subscribe to the channel. Because out here in the quiet places, there are still stories waiting to find their way home. And some of them are looking for you.